Hello, welcome, and a Happy New Year. I'm Anthony Day, and this is a special edition of the Sustainable Futures Report for Friday the 8th of January to start off 2021. If we're to develop a sustainable world, we need to know that the products we buy and the services we use are based on sustainable sources. We need to be able to track things back along the supply chain and gather information at every stage. How do we do that? Well, I recently spoke to Tyler Chaffo at Avery Dennison. My guest today is Tyler Chaffo, manager at Global Sustainability Intelligent Labels and RFID at Avery Dennison. Tyler has combined his personal and professional passion for sustainability as manager, Global Sustainability Intelligent Labels. By combining nearly a decade of experience in RFID and an educational background focused on supply chains and integrating sustainable business practices, Tyler has focused on identifying solutions for stakeholders that focus on enabling the circular economy and a transition to a low carbon economy. Tyler, welcome to the Sustainable Futures Report.
Anthony, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be on today.
Okay, well, we're going to talk about a new report which has recently been commissioned by your company, the New Transparency. But before we get on to that, I'm intrigued by the idea of an intelligent label. That must be much more than a piece of sticky paper. Tell me a bit more about intelligent labels.
Absolutely. And, the term intelligent labels is not only our business unit at Avery Dennison, but it's really reflective of kind of the products we make. And it's not to say that all of the labels out there are quote unquote dumb labels. But to your point, we've transcended the traditional just sticky paper labels, if you will. The notion of intelligent labels is basically the ability to create a unique digital identity or digital twin for everyday products. So there's a variety of different ways in which we do that. Basically trigger technologies. It could be UHF RFID as an example, NFC, a QR code, or a 2D barcode.
Okay, there's a lot of jargon in there. Can you just explain those QR? I think we all recognize. What were the things you mentioned before?
Sure. So UHF RFID, if you're not familiar with it, you've certainly encountered it, and you might not have known it. So UHF RFID is basically has widely been adopted globally in retail and apparel operations. So it's used primarily for inventory accuracy right now, although that's certainly gone up the supply chain, which I'll speak to. But it's in essence a way for retailers to quickly and more importantly accurately take an inventory count. So it's what we like to refer to as a one-to-many. So one person counting many items quickly. So I can count several thousand items in mere seconds. NFC, think of it as Apple Pay. It stands for near field communication. So it's now more of a one-to-one interaction. So, and it's also got some proximity impact. You've got to be very close to products and services to interact with them. QR code functions the same way. It doesn't have the actual technology, the physical component behind it. It's just printed on a label. Low energy Bluetooth is more similar, I'll say, to NFC. It's just another different frequency band. All kind of fall under our umbrella of being trigger agnostic, but basically connecting to a unique digital identity in a cloud. So rather than having a unique, let's say, gray t-shirt, you have a specific this gray t-shirt that's serialized. So it is specific. There is only one of them in the world, and I know all this information about it, which we'll speak to.
Okay, so you can embed technology into the label, which can then react with some sort of detecting device.
That's perfect. Yep, I would say that's it in a nutshell. We're basically embedding it on a chip, more or less, and then that chip then communicates to a variety of different methods. It could be your phone, depending on the technology. It could be a handheld reader. It could be a fixed reader. But yeah, you pretty much nailed it, I would say.
All right, well, let's move on to the new transparency, which is the title of the report which your company's recently commissioned. First of all, I get the impression from reading it that there's a lot more to transparency than traceability, although traceability is an important part of it.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that? And can you explain how this links with sustainability?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you asked this question specifically. I think traceability is somewhat foundational to transparency. I look at transparency more being an umbrella term, where traceability is certainly a key component of it. The new transparency really is looking at what are technologies that are emerging out there to enable transparency, and then really providing the definition of what transparency is. And to give a few anecdotal examples, if I'm in the food industry, knowing my product, where it's come from, when it expires, is pretty much foundational to doing business. I need to know when it expires to prevent food waste. I need to know where it's come from, because in the US, certainly this year, we've had probably at least half a dozen product recalls on produce, such as romaine lettuce, onions. Rather than just removing the product that's affected, most retailers don't have a way to identify products been affected, so they throw out all of the product category, which obviously amounts to a huge amount of food waste. All of these things combined, really, it's transparency, in my view, is kind of synonymous with sustainability. Sustainability is very much a blanket term, I'll say. As you're well aware, you ask 10 people, you'll probably get 10 different answers in terms of what sustainability means to them. I think transparency really gives you I want to say transparency is going to be a really big thing. I think it already is a big thing, which is kind of what the new transparency report talks about. But I think it's going to be elevated even further. Quite frankly, knowing where your products come from, knowing what's in it, knowing what to do with it after it's reached its useful life, are all things that are related to sustainability. If I know I have recycled content, if I know it was made ethically and grown ethically, I know how much water was used to make it. If I know what it's composed of, and I know how to recycle it at end of life, if it's packaging, as an example. So these are all things that are core to sustainability, as well as the circular economy.
So you can create a label which effectively records and documents the life cycle progress of a product. Am I right?
Absolutely. I mean, think of it in terms of a product certificate, more or less. We're able to encode on under this digital identity, physical and digital identity, all of the information that I mentioned above. And so, if you're a retailer and you have certain mandates around using FSC paper or using cotton that's organic, that adheres to your sustainability commitments, that absolutely would go in as part of this, let's say, digital identity. And now we're tracking that. And so that information then can be used in a number of different ways. It can be used, to communicate to the consumer and say, this is a product that's made sustainably. I mean, as consumers are more and more increasingly willing to not only pay more, but demanding more sustainable products. They're also demanding more transparency. As they want to know where their products come from. They want to know how it's been made. They want to know what to do with it after it's reached its useful life. So providing that information on the front end, as well as all the information that happens down the supply chain, ultimately enables the brands and retailers to make smarter decisions, but also to engage their customers on deeper levels.
Okay, well, this is very important because I'm sure you're aware that there are problems with a lot of products in terms of their origin. I mean, you probably know about Manuka honey, which is the premium type of honey. And here in the UK, we apparently sell far more Manuka honey than is actually produced in New Zealand. So it's either adulterated or it's just not what it says it was. There's the problem also with timber, which, there's endangered timber species, and it can be slipped into the supply chain and people can never be sure exactly where it's come from. So if we can develop transparency with the sort of systems you're describing, that's got to be good for everybody. But the key question is how you can actually assure the integrity, because if somebody can falsify a label, then it'll slip into the system and nobody will know. Where are the safeguards?
Yeah, I'd say that's a really brilliant question. You asked earlier, what falls under transparency? Traceability is part of it. Traceability, I would say, kind of really came about for the gray market diversion, counterfeiting, such as what you're talking about now. Um,
Mhm.
Product authentication is a big component as well for a number of reasons. I mean, not only do counterfeit products, they're not made according to brand standards, but generally they tend to be very much issues in terms of sustainability. They're not made using the same materials. They're not made using the same regulations. So I think it's a critical component to transparency and uh, the ways in which you basically make, I'll say, the authentication immutable, if you will, is the fact that it's really to your questions earlier. I think blockchain is kind of a key component that comes into the frame here. Blockchain's obviously a pretty widely used buzzword these days. Probably not quite as much as sustainability, but a lot. When we look at blockchain and transparency, there's a lot of things that happen there, and blockchain's been used for a long time to really prevent fraud for a number of reasons. And one of it is it's a distributed network and it's peer to peer, meaning not everyone can access all parts of this, let's say, chain. So I have a component on the chain that I provide information on. Some other party along the value chain provides information, which all kind of adds to this digital record. So that decreases the ability for fraud to really happen there. The other part about it is it's permissioned. So not everyone has access to this digital record. So the stakeholders are really the ones that can do that. There's also the ability that when you have blockchain, that you basically are creating something that's a living, moving kind of record, but it's something that it's also verifiable as well. So for example, it's not something that I can go in and really change access to someone's record down below, because it's not something that I have visibility to. We actually just released a product the other day called Certiglow, which is mainly a product authentication tool for the apparel industry. So a consumer or retailer can scan this product and know that it's been made authentically. So, I think you're seeing these kind of abilities to, really bridge the gap between, authentic goods and inauthentic goods.
Okay, yes. You also have a life cycle assessment tool. How does that fit into the picture?
Yeah. So at Avery Dennison, we have a tool around life cycle assessment called our Green Print tool. It's really something that we use across our different business units. Some of our business units for various reasons, but it's really meant to look at the products we make and really measure their impact as traditional life cycle assessments tools do. So primarily, depending on the business unit, it can be used to just measure the material part of it, or it can be the materials and the manufacturing part of it, depending on the products we make. But really looking at, let's say I have a hang tag that has plastic in it, and now I want to replace it with paper. What is that impact? Now that we have that information, we can then grab that, and because we're creating this digital record, we can actually now add that to the digital record. And then depending on the brands and retailers, if they have their own product information, their own data for, let's say, a garment, then that gets added there as well. So now you've got more of a carbon footprint picture. And then on top of that, you can then layer in level event data. So as the garment moves to the supply chain, this record gets updated with this level event data. So it really becomes dynamic and not static. So, depending on the origin and destination, obviously, as that can have obviously a decent amount of impact on the overall product carbon footprint. So it's really, creating a much more accurate picture around the true carbon footprint of a product versus just, doing estimates at a SKU level, which doesn't take into account origin and destination.
Okay. Now, how does all this fit in with the circular economy?
Yeah, the circular economy is, again, it's another widely used term these days. And in fact, our number one sustainability goal is about creating products that can enable the circular economy. So it's something that's near and dear to us. I'd say it fits into it in a number of ways. In order to enable a circular economy, it's not just focusing on recycling. We have to also design out waste. We also have to reduce materials where possible. We also have to design products that can be recycled. So all of these things are kind of paramount, and so transparency can do that, right? So if I know how the product's made, then I know potentially how to recycle it. Taking into account the apparel industry now, which is really focusing heavily on garment recycling. There's a big emphasis between chemical versus mechanical recyclers, and really having to have a deep knowledge around what the product's actually made of. Some recyclers can deal with more than monomaterials. Some can only deal with monomaterials. So really knowing what's in the product is critical in order to enable the recyclability of it. We're also seeing it prop up in other ways too, such as the resale market. So if I have a digital identity and I have transparency into my product, we're now able to basically make that information available whenever the customer is done with the product. And so they can scan it, and then it can says, okay, this product's X amount of years old, it has X amount of use, it's worth $10 to $15 on the resale market. And now here's a credit for you to resell it, and now you can go buy a new product. So not only are you enabling the circular economy, but for brands and retailers that choose to adopt this, now they have a return customer. So in essence, it's really a win-win. We're extracting more value out of these materials than just sending it to landfill, and we're really just scratching the surface there.
Well, that's great. I mean, we don't want to send things to landfill, do we?
No.
You've spoken about perishables, about food. You've spoken
Right.
about the garment trade. This presumably relates equally to major consumer goods, white goods like domestic appliances, even cars.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say, you've seen a lot of examples now happening across different durable and really consumer industries. Cars is definitely one of them. Right now there's a lot of focus on being able to track post-consumer resins, and so there's a big push on a lot of different brands, and certainly in the consumer packaged goods space, but also in the automotive space, that they're using increased recycled content. And as you know, one of the challenges with really using any kind of recycled product is actually verifying you actually are using recycled product. Obviously, you've probably seen that there are certain markets where, let's say, virgin plastic bottles are ground up and then passed off as post-consumer resin, which is not really accurate because it's never actually been used. And so I think we're starting to see that happen in the automotive industry. There was actually just a German manufacturer this week that announced they're using a blockchain traceability standard to track their content of their recycled plastic. And it's really about mass balance as well, knowing that they're getting in exactly what they're putting out. I think you're going to see that happen more and more, so that brands that have specific goals around X amount of recycled plastic by 2025, 2030, whatever the year is, actually being able to verify that's actually happened.
You're storing so much information that it's clearly not just printed on a label. Are we getting to the stage where a consumer is going to be able to scan a label with their phone or whatever and get consumer related information on the product that they're looking at, which could be all sorts of things, from whether it's a piece of food which is within its sell by date, or whether it's a car which has done far more miles than it should have done, or things like that?
I would say yes, and if I could say yes times 1,000, then that would be my answer. But yeah, the short answer is absolutely yes. To your point, a lot of that information will be stored digitally, but the important thing to keep in mind here is this connection between the physical and the digital. So there is information we're still printing, but it's mostly the traditional information that you would see on any kind of label. Now, if we're talking like a 2D barcode, that would actually be a physically printed barcode. That kind of looks like an ink blot to give you a description. I'm sure you're familiar with QR codes, obviously. But the consumers now can scan that. So scanning a QR code from their mobile device, NFC is also now NFC is mostly a consumer application. So it's a digitally native app on all Android devices. It's now native on all iOS devices after a certain iOS update, which happened a few years ago.
Yeah.
So now consumers have the ability to, even if it's an NFC type tag, to be able to scan that information as well. So you're going to see that increase as well. When consumers demand more transparency, you'll see more direct consumer applications.
Is that in the shops now, or are we waiting, expecting to see it in the next few months and years?
I would say it is absolutely in the shops now. A lot of the things that I talked about are all in the shops now in terms of use cases. I'll say you're going to see it accelerate. You're also going to see it accelerate and expand to other segments. You see it a lot in apparel, but I think you'll see it more in food. And its ability to really engage your consumer, on a deeper level. And I think it's an opportunity to educate them as well. I look at, let's say eco labels as an example. There's 400 plus eco labels that exist out there. There's organic. There's non-GMO. There's so many that, there's gluten free. There's so many that exist out there. As a consumer, how do you justify and really say, well, how's one better than the other? And so you're going to see this notion of really engaging the consumer more deeply at a product level, and you're going to do that through these interactions that I mentioned.
Well, it's an amazing future, isn't it? Information.
Mm-hmm. And it really is an exciting time to be involved in this space. There is a lot happening, and one of the things is COVID-19's really accelerated the need for deeper transparency.
Yeah. Oh, well, yes, of course, we haven't spoken about the medical industry
Exactly.
at all, and that must be a vast potential market.
Yeah, well, even in the food space as well, I know this happened in the UK as it did in the US, but you simultaneously had milk being dumped out while there was food bank lines miles long, and so there was this inability to marry supply and demand. So not only were we wasting food, but there was food insecure populations, and it was because we didn't have enough transparency into our supply chains to really create this nexus point. And so it accelerated the need for transparency. And then when you think of PPE shortages and really knowing where PPE's at and kind of the lead times to get that back, and then obviously all of this focus on the vaccine, and the vaccine has to maintain a cold chain process. And if it goes above half a degree, then it loses its efficacy. I mean, transparency's been accelerated, I would say.
Well, that's really been a very interesting conversation, Tyler. Thank you very much for your time today. Now, the report, the new transparency, is available freely from your website. I shall put a link to that on the podcast. And it remains for me to thank you very much for taking your time to talk to the Sustainable Futures Report today. Thanks.
Absolutely, Anthony. And it was my esteemed pleasure. This is really an exciting topic, and we are very excited to be at the forefront of it and to really be involved moving forward. So thanks for having me on.
Tyler Chaffo of Avery Dennison. And there's a link to the new transparency, the report, on the website. And that's all for this special edition of the Sustainable Futures Report. Before I go, I wonder if you've been listening to the BBC's Wreath Lectures. This is an annual series of lectures, and this year they're presented by Mark Carney, who until recently was the Governor of the Bank of England. You can probably find the lectures on the BBC Radio website, and of course they're on the BBC Sounds app. There are 4 lectures, and number 4, Climate Crisis to Real Prosperity, covers sustainability. Again, there's a link to these lectures on my website, sustainablefutures.report. I did say I was going to take a break in January, but in fact, you have another special edition to look forward to. I've had a discussion with 4 experts on the subject of carbon, and that'll be available to you on Friday the 22nd, some days earlier for patrons. Until then, I'm Anthony Day. That was a special Sustainable Futures Report, and I'll be back again in 2 weeks. Have a good fortnight.